There is a photograph that every documentary about the Kennedy family uses. The whole family gathered at Hyannisport, on the lawn, in the bright Massachusetts summer sunlight. The children in white, the parents at the center, everyone looking at the camera, everyone smiling. It is one of the most reproduced photographs in the history of American politics. And if you look at it long enough past the smiles, past the sunlight, past the specific, they practiced ease of a family that had been photographed so many times. They had learned to perform naturalness for the camera. You begin to notice something. The smiles do not reach the eyes. Not all of them. Not always. The woman at the center of that photograph, the woman who organized every detail of those summers, who scheduled every meal and every outing and every debate at the dinner table, who designed the system that produced the most powerful political family in American history, was Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. She lived to 104 years old. She outlived 4 of her 9 children. She outlived 1 son killed in the Second World War, 1 daughter killed in a plane crash in France, 1 son assassinated in a Dallas motorcade, 1 son assassinated in a Los Angeles hotel kitchen. She outlived the lobotomy she did not authorize and was not told about for years, performed on her eldest daughter, Rosemary, whose subsequent 20 years of institutional life Rose managed by not discussing it. She outlived a marriage that required her to absorb, in complete public silence, the documented, brazen infidelity of a husband who conducted his most famous affair with a Hollywood actress and expected his wife to manage the social calendar of the woman he was sleeping with. She outlived all of it. And here is the question that this video is going to ask, the question that 60 years of Kennedy mythology has never asked directly. What if the machine that consumed the Kennedy children was not the White House or the press or the specific, cursed gravity of the Kennedy name? What if the machine was built before any of that? What if it was built in the nurseries and the dining rooms and the summer lawn at Hyannisport? What if Rose Kennedy built it herself? I am Mary, and today, for the first time on this channel, we are going to tell the story of the woman at the origin of everything. Not as a matriarch, not as a symbol, not as the stoic, dignified, endlessly composed figure that the Kennedy mythology has always required her to be. As a person, as the woman who built the system that produced Camelot and who then watched that system consume, one by one, the children she had raised inside it. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, the photograph on the lawn will look different to you, and it will not look the same again. Before the Kennedy name, before the White House, before any of it, there was a girl in Boston who was the daughter of the most charming politician in Massachusetts, and who understood from her earliest years what it meant to perform a life for a public audience. What Rose Fitzgerald learned in that household, and what she carried from it into her own marriage and her own children, is the foundation of the machine that is coming. The girl before the machine. Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald was born on the 22nd of July, 1890, in Boston, Massachusetts. Her father was John Francis Fitzgerald, known to everyone in Boston as Honey Fitz, a politician of extraordinary charm and equally extraordinary ambition. He had been born into the Irish immigrant community of Boston's North End, had worked his way through the specific grinding machinery of Boston democratic politics, and had eventually become the mayor of Boston. He was loud. He was gregarious. He could sing literally. He was known to break into song at public events, and he understood instinctively that politics was performance, and that the best performers won. Rose was his eldest daughter, his favorite. He took her everywhere, to political events, to rallies, to dinners where the city's most powerful men ate and drank and made the decisions that shaped Boston's life. Rose sat at tables where she was the youngest person by 20 years, and listened and absorbed and learned, without being told she was learning what it looked like when powerful people moved through the world. She was being trained, without that word being used, in the specific art of public performance, of presenting a version of yourself that serves the occasion, of never letting the audience see the thing behind the thing. She was brilliant. This is documented, not invented. She was admitted to Wellesley College at a time when the academic standards for admission were rigorous and the competition was intense. She wanted to go. Her father said no. He sent her instead to the Convent of the Sacred Heart, first in Boston, then in Europe. The convent education of the early 20th century was specific in its design. It produced women who were poised, who were devout, who were educated in the things that were considered appropriate for Catholic women of a certain class, and who understood deeply and without question that their role in the world was adjacent to power rather than central to it. They were the wives and mothers of important men. They were not the important men themselves. Rose absorbed this too. She absorbed it, and she converted it in the specific way of a very intelligent person who has been given a framework that does not quite fit into something she could use. She could not be the powerful person. She could shape the powerful people. She could build the environment that produced them. When she married Joseph Patrick Kennedy on October 7, 1914, at a ceremony attended by the most important Catholic families in Boston, she was marrying the specific ambition that her father had taught her to recognize. Joe Kennedy was going to be somebody. Everyone in that church knew it. Rose knew it. And Rose had a plan. Now here is what the plan looked like. And why it worked. And why the working of it cost more than anyone around her was ever permitted to acknowledge. Joseph Kennedy was the son of a saloon keeper who had worked his way into banking and then into the specific, profitable worlds of Hollywood and Wall Street and political connection. He was charming in the way that very ambitious men who need other people are charming warm when warmth served the purpose, cold when coldness was more efficient. He had a mind that operated like a calculator and the social ease of someone who had spent his entire life making himself likable to people who had more power than he did. He also had a specific, documented, ongoing relationship with the idea of fidelity that suggested he had not given it much serious consideration. The affairs began early. The most famous, his relationship with actress Gloria Swanson, which lasted for years, and was conducted with a brazenness that the people around them described as almost deliberately visible, was not a secret within the circles where the Kennedys moved. Swanson herself wrote about it in her memoir. She described Joe Kennedy pursuing her with the full force of his considerable charm and organizational capacity. She described Rose Kennedy, her husband's wife, maintaining a social relationship with Swanson of sufficient warmth that observers found it genuinely difficult to interpret. What did Rose know? Everything. This is the answer supported by the accounts of people who knew the family during this period. Rose Kennedy knew about Gloria Swanson. She knew about the affairs that came before Swanson and the affairs that came after. She knew in the way that the wife of a man who conducts himself as Joe Kennedy conducted himself always knows, not from a conversation, not from a confession, but from the specific, accumulated evidence of a life lived alongside someone who is not trying very hard to hide it. And here is what Rose did with that knowledge. She converted it. In the specific, documented way of a woman who had been educated by nuns to understand that suffering endured in silence was spiritually meritorious. She took the knowledge of what her husband was doing and she placed it inside her Catholicism. She went to Mass, daily, eventually. She prayed. She deepened her faith in the specific way that faith deepens, when it is the only structure available to absorb something that has no other container. And she said nothing publicly. Not then, not for decades. Not until much later, in an interview given when she was very old, when she said with the specific, measured frankness of a woman who had been keeping accounts for 60 years, that she had considered leaving her husband once, that she had gone home to her parents, that her father had told her to go back. She went back, and she built the machine. The machine had a very specific design. It had schedules and index cards and dinner table debates and the specific, documented vocabulary of a household run like an institution rather than a home. And it had one overriding purpose: to produce greatness. What it did not have, what it was specifically, structurally designed to exclude, is the detail that explains everything that happened to the Kennedy children in their adult lives. That is coming. The machine. Rose Kennedy kept index cards on her children. This is documented. It is not a metaphor. She maintained a physical card system, index cards, organized and updated, that recorded the medical history, the developmental milestones, the vaccinations, the illnesses, the significant events of each of her 9 children's lives. It was an extraordinary act of organization. It was also, and this is the detail, that the accounts of people who grew up inside the Kennedy household consistently return to not the act of a mother keeping records for sentimental reasons. It was the act of a manager tracking inventory. The Kennedy household ran on schedules. Rose designed them. Rising times, meal times, study times, activity times, bedtimes, all of it, organized with a precision that the accounts of the Kennedy children describe as military in its consistency. There was a place for everything and a time for everything, and the children were expected to be where they were supposed to be, doing what they were supposed to be doing, at the time they were supposed to be doing it. The dinner table was the performance stage. Joe Kennedy's contribution to the dinner table was the debate. He required his children to know current events. He assigned topics. He expected opinions, argued, defended, challenged. The child who could not hold a position under questioning was failing at something that mattered in this household. The child who could argue well, who could present a case and defend it against opposition, who could think on their feet and perform intelligence under pressure, that child was succeeding. The dinner table debates have been described by everyone who experienced or witnessed them as genuinely intellectually stimulating. The Kennedy children were among the most articulate and politically informed young people of their generation, in part because they had been required since childhood to think and speak about ideas in front of an audience that would push back. This was not nothing. This was a real and significant gift. But here is what the dinner table did not have room for: weakness, difficulty, the specific, ordinary, human experience of a child who is struggling with school, with friendship, with the ordinary developmental challenges of growing up, and who needs to bring that struggle into the family conversation and have it received without judgment. The Kennedy household did not have a structure for that. When Rosemary Kennedy, the eldest daughter, born in 1918, 1 year after Joe Jr., struggled in school, struggled socially, struggled with the specific, undifferentiated difficulty that was eventually understood to be a developmental disability, the household's response was not to create space for Rosemary's difference. The response was to manage the difference, to find ways for Rosemary to appear more functional than she was, to bring in tutors, to design situations that minimized the visibility of her struggles, to maintain as long as possible the surface of a Kennedy child who was meeting the Kennedy standard. The response was performance management. This was not cruelty. Rose Kennedy loved Rosemary. The accounts of her relationship with her eldest daughter are full of genuine tenderness of Rose working with Rosemary on her lessons, of Rose taking Rosemary to social events, of Rose constructing situations in which Rosemary could participate in family life without the gap between her abilities and the Kennedy standard becoming too visible. But the gap existed. And the machine, the specific, structured, performance-oriented system that Rose had built, was not designed to accommodate it. When the gap became impossible to manage, when Rosemary, in her early 20s, began to exhibit behavioral changes that the household could not contain, the decision was made to address it surgically. Rose Kennedy did not make that decision. Joe Kennedy made it. And he did not tell Rose. In 1941, Rosemary Kennedy underwent a prefrontal lobotomy at George Washington University Hospital. She was 23 years old. The procedure was performed by Walter Freeman and James Watts, 2 physicians who believed that severing certain neural connections could reduce emotional volatility in patients who were difficult to manage. The procedure destroyed Rosemary. She lost the ability to speak coherently. She lost control of her left side. She was, after the lobotomy, profoundly and permanently disabled in ways she had not been before. She was institutionalized at St. T. Coletta's in Jefferson, Wisconsin, where she would live for the next 63 years. Rose was not told. Joe told her eventually. The accounts differ on exactly when, but the substance of what the accounts agree on is this. Rose Kennedy did not know what had been done to her daughter until after it was done. And the revelation when it came was processed by Rose in the same way she processed everything that the marriage required her to process. In silence. In prayer. In the continuation of the life that the machine demanded of her, she did not see Rosemary for 20 years. This detail has been explained by various people in various ways, as protective, as emotionally necessary, as the specific defense mechanism of a woman whose grief was too large to be managed by proximity. All of these explanations may contain truth. But here is what the 20-year absence also was. It was the machine operating exactly as designed. When something did not meet the Kennedy standard, when the gap between what the machine required and what a Kennedy child could produce became visible, the machine's response was removal, not acknowledgement, not accommodation, removal. And Rose Kennedy, who had built the machine, lived inside the same logic. Between 1944 and 1968, Rose Kennedy buried 3 of her children, not 1, 3. Each death was public, each one was national news, and each one required Rose Kennedy to perform, in front of the entire country, the specific composure that the machine demanded. What those performances cost her, and what one specific, documented moment reveals about what was happening underneath the composure, is the most private and the most heartbreaking part of this story. That is coming. What the machine cost. On the 12th of August, 1944, Joseph Kennedy Jr. was killed over the English Channel. He had volunteered for a mission that was described to him as extremely dangerous. He was piloting a plane loaded with explosives that was supposed to be remotely detonated after he and his co-pilot parachuted out. The plane detonated prematurely. There was no parachute. There was no survival. There was no body to bring home. Joe Jr. was 29 years old. He had been his father's primary investment, the son onto whom Joseph Kennedy Sr. had placed the full weight of his presidential ambitions. Joe Jr. was going to be the first Kennedy president. That had been the plan since Joe Jr. was old enough for a plan. Rose was at the family's home in Hyannis Port when 2 priests arrived at the door. She understood immediately what 2 priests arriving unannounced meant. She went outside. She walked along the beach, alone, for a long time. The accounts of what she did in the hours after learning that her eldest son was dead vary in their details, but agree on this. She went somewhere private. She absorbed it. And then she came back, and the machine continued. In May 1948, Kathleen Kennedy was killed in a plane crash over France. She was 28 years old. She had been travelling with Peter Fitzwilliam, a married English aristocrat with whom she had been having an affair. The relationship had caused a specific rupture with Rose, not because of the affair, which Rose knew about, but because Fitzwilliam was divorced, and Kathleen, as a Catholic, could not marry a divorced man in the church. Rose had made her position clear. The relationship was unacceptable. Kathleen died in the company of the man Rose had told her she could not be with. Rose's response to Kathleen's death was complicated by this, in ways that the family mythology has consistently smoothed over. The specific, documented evidence of Rose's relationship with Kathleen in the years before her death, the letters, the conversations reported by people close to both of them, suggests a genuine rift that the death prevented from being healed. Kathleen was buried in England, not in Massachusetts, not with her family, in England, where she had chosen to live. Rose did not attend the funeral. This is documented, and it has been interpreted differently by different people as the final expression of a mother's disapproval, as the grief of a woman who could not travel, as the specific, complex silence of a Catholic mother whose daughter had died in circumstances that the church did not sanction. Whatever its cause, Rose Kennedy did not stand at her daughter's grave. She was still managing the gap between what the machine required and what reality produced. Now here is the moment that this video has been building toward. The moment that breaks through the composure. The moment that the machine could not contain. November Dudu, a symbol and lattice seti. Rose Kennedy was at her home in Hyannis Port when the reports began coming in from Dallas. She was listening to the radio. She was walking. She walked every day, a habit of decades, the body moving while the mind processed whatever the day required it to process. Her son Robert came to find her. He walked with her. He told her what had happened in Dallas. And here is what Rose Kennedy did. She went to her room. She changed into her golf clothes. She went out and played golf. The people around her, the family, the staff, the people who witnessed this, described it at the time, and in subsequent accounts with a consistent bewilderment. Rose Kennedy had just been told that her son, the President of the United States, had been assassinated. And she went to play golf. The explanations have varied. Some people who knew Rose described it as shock, the specific, dissociative response of a body that cannot process what the mind has been told. Some described it as denial. Some described it as the machine operating at its most extreme. The Kennedy response to catastrophe was to continue, to keep moving, to not allow the collapse that the catastrophe demanded. But here is what I want to offer as a different possibility. Rose Kennedy had buried Joe Jr. She had buried Kathleen. She had managed Rosemary's disappearance into an institution without breaking publicly. She had absorbed 20 years of her husband's infidelities without public acknowledgement. She had built and maintained and operated, for nearly 50 years, a system that required the performance of strength in the face of everything. Maybe she had no idea how to stop performing. Maybe the machine had been running so long. Maybe she had built it so completely into the structure of how she existed that when November 22 arrived, she could only do what the machine knew how to do. Keep going. Even when keeping going looked, to everyone around her, like something that should not have been possible. She gave one interview years later in which she said, "It is wrong for parents to bury their children." 6 words. The most honest thing she said publicly about what the machine had cost her. Rose Kennedy outlived her husband. She outlived the assassination of 2 sons. She outlived Chappaquiddick the night in 1969, when her youngest son Ted drove a car off a bridge and a 28-year-old woman drowned. What Rose Kennedy said and did not say about Chappaquiddick is one of the most telling moments in the history of a family that managed its own narrative with extraordinary precision. That is coming. Chappaquiddick and the silence. By the summer of 1969, Rose Kennedy was 78 years old. She had outlived her eldest son. She had outlived her daughter. She had outlived her husband, Joe Kennedy. Sr. had suffered a massive stroke in 1961 and spent the last 8 years of his life unable to speak, paralyzed on one side, managed by the same system of institutional care that the Kennedy family applied to every difficulty. He died in November 1969. She had outlived the assassination of John in 1963 and the assassination of Robert in 1968, which had happened 14 months earlier at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, in a hotel kitchen, in front of Ethel Kennedy, who was 3 months pregnant with their 11th child. She had outlived all of it. And then came the night of the 18th of July, 1969. Ted Kennedy, the youngest son, the last surviving Kennedy brother, the one who had been sent to boarding school and reshuffled through the family's political operations and had arrived, by the late 1960s, at the position of United States Senator for Massachusetts, attended a party on Chappaquiddick Island in Massachusetts. He left the party with a young woman named Mary Jo Kopechne. His car went off the Dyke Bridge and into the water below. Ted Kennedy survived. Mary Jo Kopechne did not. And Ted Kennedy did not report the accident to the police for approximately 10 hours. When the story emerged, and it emerged quickly, because there is no containing a story of that specific gravity, the Kennedy family's crisis machinery activated immediately. Lawyers, advisors, political strategists, the full apparatus of a family that had been managing its public narrative for 40 years assembled around Ted Kennedy with the speed and efficiency of long practice. And Rose Kennedy, 78 years old, who had buried 3 children, who had absorbed her husband's infidelity and her daughter's death in France, and the lobotomy she had not authorized, and the loss of a grandson in 1963 and a son in 1968, made her position known. She supported Ted, publicly, without qualification, in the specific, unconditional way of a matriarch who had built the machine and was not going to allow one night on a Massachusetts island to dismantle it. She attended events with Ted. She appeared beside him. She was the Kennedy family's most powerful signal to the world that Ted Kennedy was still a Kennedy, still part of the institution, still supported by the woman who had built it. Now here is what this support cost in human terms that the Kennedy mythology tends to elide. Mary Jo Chappaquiddick was 28 years old. She had worked on Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign. She had been, by the accounts of people who knew her, a young woman of genuine intelligence and commitment, someone who had been drawn into the Kennedy political world by the specific, galvanizing force of Robert Kennedy's 1968 campaign, and who had devoted serious professional energy to it. She died in the water off Chappaquiddick Island. The evidence examined by the inquest suggested she had survived the initial crash, that she had found an air pocket in the car, that she had been alive for some period of time after the car went off the bridge. Rose Kennedy said nothing about Mary Jo Chappaquiddick. Publicly, in any documented interview or statement, nothing. This is not unusual. The family's general approach to Chappaquiddick was managed silence, punctuated by carefully worded statements of support for Ted. But Rose's silence about Mary Jo, specifically in a family that had experienced the loss of children, and that had, in various ways, acknowledged the human cost of the tragedies it had weathered, is notable, because here is what Rose Kennedy had spent 60 years building. A system in which the institution mattered more than the individual, in which the performance of the Kennedy family's greatness was more important than the acknowledgement of the Kennedy family's costs, in which the gap between what the machine required and what reality produced was managed by removal of Rosemary, of Kathleen's complications, of whatever could not be made to fit the narrative. Chappaquiddick was the machine operating at the most extreme scale it had ever been asked to operate. A woman was dead. The machine continued. And Rose Kennedy, who had built it, who had operated it for 60 years, who had converted her own pain into its fuel, stood behind it. In the last years of her life, after the strokes began, after the ability to speak clearly diminished, after the woman who had managed every detail of 9 children's lives was reduced to a wheelchair on the lawn at Hyannis Port, something happened that the Kennedy family's public narrative has never fully addressed. What Rose Kennedy's final years actually looked like, and the specific, devastating irony of what the machine had left her with at the end, is coming. What the machine left her. Rose Kennedy suffered her first significant stroke in 1984. She was 93 years old. The stroke affected her speech and her mobility. She recovered partially enough to continue living at the family's compound in Hyannis Port, enough to be present at family gatherings, enough to be the visible matriarch that the Kennedy mythology required for as long as the mythology required it. But she was diminished, in the specific, irreversible way that strokes diminish people not all at once, not completely, but in the slow, accumulating way of a capability being quietly withdrawn. She had additional strokes in the years that followed. And here is the specific, devastating irony that the last years of Rose Kennedy's life produced. She had built a machine that ran on performance, on composure, on the specific, controlled presentation of a self that served the institution rather than the individual. She had spent 93 years doing it, converting her pain into silence, her grief into prayer, her knowledge of what her husband was doing and what the institution required into the sustained, extraordinary performance of a woman who had everything under control. And then the strokes began. And the performance became, for the first time in Rose Kennedy's life, something she could not fully control. The woman who had never, in 100 years of public life, allowed the audience to see the thing behind the thing began, in the involuntary way of neurological impairment, to be unable to maintain the barrier. There are accounts of Rose in her final years that describe moments of the word the accounts use is distress, a word that the Kennedy mythology, applied to Rose Kennedy, does not normally produce. Rose distressed. Rose unable to manage the performance. Rose, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, in a situation that the machine she had built was not capable of resolving. She had built the machine for her children. She had not built it for herself. The children, the ones who were still alive, who had been produced by the machine and sent out into the world by it, were living the consequences of what it had built. Ted was in the Senate, damaged by Chappaquiddick and by the specific, accumulated weight of being the last Kennedy brother. The daughters and daughters-in-law and grandchildren were navigating the specific, ongoing difficulty of existing inside a family whose name carried a mythological weight that made ordinary life nearly impossible. The machine was still running, but Rose, the woman who had designed it, who had fueled it, who had kept it operating through the loss of 4 children, and the infidelity of a husband, and the lobotomy she had not authorized, and the Chappaquiddick she had chosen to support, was no longer at the controls. She died on the 22nd of January 1995. She was 104 years old. She had outlived her husband by 25 years. She had outlived Joe Jr. by 51 years. She had outlived Kathleen by 47 years. She had outlived Jack by 32 years. She had outlived Bobby by 27 years. She had not outlived Rosemary. Rosemary was still alive at St. Coletta's in Wisconsin, where she would continue to live until 2005, surviving her mother by 10 years. The last image of Rose Kennedy in the historical record is a woman in a wheelchair on the lawn at Hyannis Port. She is looking at the water. She is not performing. She is not composing herself for the camera. She is just there, on the lawn, looking at the water. Behind her, inside the house, or scattered across the country, in the specific, dispersed way of a very large and very complicated family, are the people the machine had produced. And the question that Rose Kennedy never answered, the question that the 104 years of her life accumulated and never resolved, is whether she knew, whether she understood, at the end, what the machine had cost. Not just in the specific, countable terms of children buried, and daughters institutionalized, and daughters-in-law consumed, and grandchildren navigating the specific, impossible weight of a name that had become a myth, but in the terms that the machine had always refused to acknowledge, the terms of ordinary human need. The hug not given because the machine did not have a protocol for hugging, the grief not expressed because the machine did not have a structure for grief, the conversation not had because the machine's dinner table was designed for debate, not for the kind of talking that families need to do when the weight of what they are carrying becomes too heavy to carry alone. Whether Rose Kennedy at 104, in a wheelchair, looking at the water off Hyannis Port, understood that the machine had worked, and that working was not the same as succeeding. We will never know, because the machine, to the very end, did not create space for that conversation. There is one more layer to this story. The children, the machine produced, the ones who survived, did something with what the machine gave them that the machine's designer had not fully anticipated. And the specific, documented evidence of what the Kennedy children built in the years after they left the machine outside of it, in the world it had sent them into, is the most complicated and the most honest thing this video can say about what Rose Kennedy created. That is coming. What the children built. The machine produced extraordinary people. This is the part of the Rose Kennedy story that the both sides requirement of honest storytelling requires this video to say directly. The system Rose Kennedy built, the schedules, the dinner table debates, the index cards, the competitive environment, the relentless expectation of performance and achievement produced children who went out into the world and did things that mattered. John Kennedy was elected the 35th President of the United States at 43 years old. He navigated the Cuban Missile Crisis 13 days in October 1962, during which the world came closer to nuclear war than at any point before or since, with a restraint and a clarity that the historical record suggests prevented a catastrophe. The Test Ban Treaty, the space program, the specific, galvanizing quality of his public speaking that made millions of people believe that the country could be better than it was. These were not small things. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, pursued organized crime with a rigor that earned him permanent and powerful enemies. As a senator, he traveled to the Mississippi Delta and to the hollows of Appalachia and to the migrant labor camps of California, and came back from each trip changed, more committed to the specific, unglamorous work of making the country's promises real for the people they had never reached. His 1,968 campaign, brief as it was, had a quality of genuine moral seriousness that people who were there describe as unlike anything else they witnessed in American politics. Eunice Kennedy Shriver founded the Special Olympics. Think about that for a moment in the context of this video. Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who had grown up in the same household as Rosemary, who had watched the system fail her sister, who had been present for the lobotomy's aftermath and the institutionalization and the 20-year silence, took the specific knowledge of what her family had done to her sister and converted it into an international organization that has given millions of people with intellectual disabilities a context in which to be celebrated rather than managed. The Special Olympics is, among other things, a direct response to Rosemary Kennedy's lobotomy. Eunice built something from the wound. Ted Kennedy became one of the most consequential senators in the history of the United States. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the Family and Medical Leave Act, the Children's Health Insurance Program, decades of legislative work on civil rights, healthcare, immigration, the work of a man who had been produced by the machine and who had also been damaged by it, who had done something unforgivable on a bridge in Massachusetts, and then spent 40 years trying to be worth something in the face of that, is documented in the laws that govern American life. The machine produced all of this. And here is what this means for how we understand Rose Kennedy. The system she built, the system that required performance and excellence, and the specific, relentless pressure of a household that did not have space for ordinary human weakness, produced people who went out into the world and performed and excelled and did things of genuine significance. It also produced Rosemary's lobotomy. It also produced Kathleen's estrangement. It also produced the specific, documented inability of the Kennedy men to manage the gap between the public performance the system required and the private behavior the system had never given them a framework for examining. It also produced the silence that surrounded everything painful, the silence that Rose had modeled and maintained for 60 years, and that her children had absorbed and reproduced in their own ways, with their own costs. The machine worked. The question Rose Kennedy never answered, and the question this video is asking, is whether working was the point. Whether a system that produces presidents and senators and the Special Olympics and Camelot, and also produces lobotomized daughters and Chappaquiddick and 3 assassinated family members, and the specific, sustained inability of a family to be honest with itself about its own pain, whether that system was worth building. Rose Kennedy built it. She operated it for 60 years. She watched it produce everything it was designed to produce. And she never said publicly, on the record, in a way that the historical account preserves whether she thought it had been worth it. There is something this channel has said before in the video about Joan Kennedy, in the video about Ethel Kennedy, in the video about Carolyn Bessette and Lauren Bessette and Rosemary Kennedy, and every woman whose story this channel has told. The institution does not feel what it costs. It only produces. And the people who built it, who designed the specific architecture of expectation and silence and performance that the institution required, are rarely asked to account for what the building cost. Rose Kennedy has never been fully asked. The mythology that Jackie Kennedy constructed in a single interview 1 week after Dallas, the word Camelot, the brief shining moment, the golden age that was taken too soon, organized the Kennedy story around loss and legend in a way that made accountability feel like desecration. You cannot hold Camelot accountable. You can only mourn it. But this channel does not do mythology. It does the person underneath the mythology. And the person underneath the mythology of Rose Kennedy is this. A woman who was brilliant, who was educated to believe that her brilliance was most useful in service of someone else's greatness, who married a man whose ambition she understood and whose faithlessness she absorbed, and whose decisions she did not always endorse, but could not always stop, who built, from the specific materials the world gave her, Catholic devotion, political intelligence, The knowledge of what public performance required a system that she believed would protect her children from the world's indifference. The system worked as designed. The world was not indifferent to the Kennedy children. The world was very, very attentive to the Kennedy children, and the attentiveness consumed them in ways the system had not anticipated. Because the system had been built to produce excellence in a world that noticed excellence. It had not been built for a world that noticed everything, including the gaps between the performance and the person underneath it, including Rosemary's difference, including the affairs, including Chappaquiddick, including the specific, accumulated, unbearable weight of being a Kennedy in a world that had decided the Kennedys were Camelot. Rose Kennedy lived to 104 years old. She outlived 4 of her children. She watched her family become mythology while she was still alive to watch it. And somewhere in that long, long life, in the daily mass, in the index cards, in the letters full of instructions to children at boarding schools, in the golf game played after Dallas, in the silence about Mary Jo Kopechne, in the 20 years without visiting Rosemary, somewhere in all of that is the answer to the question this video has been asking. Was it worth it? She never said. And the machine, the specific, extraordinary, costly, productive, damaging machine she built, does not have a mechanism for answering that question. It only has a mechanism for continuing. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Rose Kennedy spent 60 years building a system that produced presidents and senators and the Special Olympics and Camelot, and also produced a lobotomized daughter and a 20-year silence, and a woman who could not attend her own daughter's funeral, and a family that absorbed 3 assassinations and Chappaquiddick by continuing. The machine worked. Does that mean it was right? Leave your answer below. I read every single comment. If this video said something about the Kennedy family that 60 years of mythology has not said, please share it. Because the story of the Kennedys has always been told from inside Camelot. This video was told from inside the machine that built it. This is Mary of Shadows. Thank you for being here.